There are few more humbling experiences for a tennis player than facing Novak Djokovic. From players thinking a match with Djokovic is a 50-50 to bad-mouthing the Serb off the court, his opponents can sometimes be overly confident before their matches. This then leads to what I like to call the Djokovic effect. First, Djokovic gets badmouthed by someone, and then Djokovic absolutely steamrolls whoever badmouthed him. Today, we're going through some of my favorite examples. I do want to point out that of course players should be confident going into a match with anyone, and that includes Novak Djokovic. I also don't think that any of the opponents in this video have committed any egregious crimes. I just think that the Djokovic effect is really funny, and that you shouldn't ever do anything to make Djokovic look like this. So don't take this video too seriously, and let's get into times that players have been seriously humbled by the Serbian legend. The most recent example of the Djokovic took place at the US Open this year. Ben Shelton was in the best form of his career so far, reaching the semifinals of a Grand Slam for the first time. Knocking out fellow Americans Frances Tiafoe and Tommy Paul in previous rounds, the 20-year-old was playing exciting, brave tennis. Confident or arrogant, depending on your point of view, he was behaving pretty much how you'd expect a 20-year-old kid to behave. In press conferences, he was bubbly, smiley, and cocky, particularly before the match against Djokovic. He wasn't exactly disrespectful to Djokovic and did acknowledge his opponent's previous victories.
Yeah, definitely a tough challenge. I think that whenever you play somebody for the first time and someone who's been in this situation so many times and come out victorious so many times, that's in the back of your head, and you just know how, rock solid the guy is, and how mentally tough, how physically tough.
However, Djokovic is certainly more than just a tough challenge, and Shelton was naive afterwards, talking about the fact that Novak hasn't ever faced him or his playstyle before, and saying that he was hoping to disrupt him.
It's an advantage with my game style, playing someone who's never played me before.
Yes, Djokovic, the player with almost 1,100 ATP wins, who has most definitely never faced an aggressive player before. During the match itself, the support from the American crowd was raucous and quite often disrespectful, cheering not only Djokovic double faults, but also first serve mistakes. Shelton found this amusing, smiling whenever it happened. The young American was also too exuberant in his celebrations, even pointing down at the court as if to say that the US Open was his house. Djokovic responded in typical Djokovic fashion, by winning the tennis match. Shelton performed well in the match, but he was not at the level needed to even trouble Novak. The Serb won in straight sets, outclassing and outmatching Shelton physically and tactically. He then gave a bit back to Ben in the crowd, performing Shelton's celebration of hanging up the phone with a cold, determined look in his eyes. His 20-year-old opponent was far from smiley at the net and seemed distraught as he walked off the court. Djokovic then went on to lift the US Open trophy, rubbing it in the wounds of the American crowd just a little bit more. In my honest opinion, I don't think Shelton was too disrespectful. He was immature and naive, which could only be expected from someone of that age. He also said some silly things in his post-match interview, like calling Novak the number 2 player after it was already decided that Djokovic would be the number 1.
Be playing the number 2 player in the world.
And he also compared Novak's mentality to his himself.
Has, a similar mentality to me on the court.
Bit strange maybe, but overall it was definitely a humbling experience for Shelton and a more humbling experience for the American crowd. Will they ever learn? 2022 was an unusual year for Novak Djokovic. Banned from competing in the Australian Open and a couple of Masters 1000 tournaments for not getting vaccinated, Djokovic had already missed out on 4,000 ranking points. He then lost to the clay goat at Roland Garros, a completely fair result. The next Grand Slam was Wimbledon, and Nole managed to emerge victorious, defeating Nick Kyrgios in the final. Due to Russians and Belarusians not being able to compete, the ATP decided that no ranking points would be awarded for the tournament, which unfortunately meant that Djokovic missed out on another 2,000 points and dropped out of the top 5 as a result. This made it very difficult for Djokovic to qualify for the ATP finals, at least if it wasn't for a rule that states the following. Up to 2 Grand Slam winners of that year, in order of their positions, positioned between 8 and 20 in the ATP rankings as of that Monday. Thanks to his Wimbledon victory, Djokovic therefore qualified for the finals, much to the chagrin of a certain Brit, Cameron Norrie. Norrie described the fact that Djokovic qualified thanks to Wimbledon as a bit strange and that it seems unfair. I can see where Norrie is coming from. He didn't get any points for a Wimbledon run that would have put him in a good position to qualify. However, winning a Grand Slam is a great accomplishment that should be rewarded, and Novak should have been competing at the ATP Finals. Djokovic went on to win that edition of the ATP Finals because of course he did, which would have stung Norrie even more. Come May, the pair were facing off in the Italian Open in Rome. Tensions were clearly high, and it was evident that Norrie was raring to go for this battle. Any opportunity he could, he was screaming "come on" at the top of his lungs. Tensions then boiled over at this point. Norrie smashed the ball at Djokovic's legs after the Serb had clearly conceded the point. His apology was then incredibly half-hearted, and he gave his loudest celebratory shot a couple of points after when he won his next service game. Djokovic was less than impressed, and Djokovic kicked it into the next gear. Norrie won only one more game and called a medical timeout at 5-4. Another moment that Djokovic thought was unsportsmanlike. Compared to the Shelton celebration, Djokovic was quite subdued at the end of the match, but I think that was calculated. With a minimal handshake and even less of a celebration, Djokovic showed that Norrie wasn't even worth the celebration in the first place. Norrie was then quite salty after the match, and he hasn't won more than 2 matches in a tournament since then. Not the best run of results for him. I've also got a feeling that Djokovic will tear Norrie apart in their next meeting. The reason I think that is because I think Novak holds a grudge. In fact, I think he has a list of players that he holds grudges against that he checks off after destroying them, like what happened with Alex de Minaur. In 2022, de Minaur was interviewed about Djokovic attempting to enter the Australian Open, but being turned away, and he seemed to be mocking Djokovic a bit with his answers, laughing at him.
Look, I just think it's just very interesting. That's all I'm going to say.
Again, Djokovic wasn't impressed. The next year, a de Minaur victory in the third round set up a clash with Novak Djokovic. In his post-match interview, de Minaur was chipper and said this:
I'm just excited. Another chance to go out here, play against the best in the world.
Unfortunately, it seems like he wasn't made of the right stuff. Djokovic dismantled him, winning 6-2, 6-1, 6-2. Novak was an absolute machine, totally outclassing de Minaur in every way. The Serb hit 26 winners and made the Australian look like a player outside the top 200, in front of his home crowd to boot. I've rarely seen such a one-sided match of tennis in my life. Djokovic set the pace in every single point and overpowered his opponent with his strokes. He made one of the fastest players on tour look sluggish and lazy, and this was truly Djokovic at the peak of his powers. He then gave one of the best post-match interview answers in history.
I'm going to ask you why you beat him so convincingly.
Because I wanted to.
I highly doubt that de Minaur will be so glib in the future. In our next example of the Djokovic effect, we have Juan Pablo Varillas. The Peruvian had never won a Grand Slam match before Roland Garros 2023, but he hit a bit of form, winning 3 5-setters to set up a match with Novak. In his post-match interview after a victory against Hubert Hurkacz, Varillas insisted that all tennis matches are 50-50. Of course, that's what you tell yourself before facing a monster like Djokovic, but a 50-50? Really? Like with de Minaur, Novak dismantled his opponent with a 6-3, 6-2, 6-2 win. Varillas got a break point in the very first game, but after that, it was entirely Djokovic. The Serb was on fire, hitting 35 winners and winning 34 more points than his Peruvian opponent. Varillas tried to do what he could to destabilize his opponent, including high looping shots, but Djokovic's powerful ground strokes were way too much for Varillas. In his post-match interview, Varillas was not only totally dejected, but he also seemed in awe of Djokovic, analyzing how the Serb beat him. He was very complimentary, but he didn't seem to be a happy figure. I imagine he probably took a long, sad shower after the match, because you see, Djokovic doesn't just destroy your legs, he also crushes your soul. Before we go into our last example of players disrespecting Djokovic, why don't you take a minute to sign up for our free newsletter covering all the news and happenings around the tennis tours. Scores of you have already signed up, and people really seem to be enjoying the updates. For our final example, we go all the way back to 2008 when Novak won his very first Grand Slam at the Australian Open. Over at the US Open, former world number 1 Andy Roddick would be facing Novak Djokovic. In a post-match interview, a journalist asked Roddick about Novak's ankle injury. The American had a lot to say.
Yeah, no, both of them.
Yeah, both.
Yeah, in the back.
And the back.
And a hip.
And what when he said there's too many to
And a
count.
cramp.
Yeah. Do you get the sense right now that he is?
Bird flu.
Yeah, a lot of things.
Yeah.
Beijing hangover.
Yeah.
At this point in his career, Djokovic was very different compared to today, and he did used to struggle with injuries and especially a respiratory issue that he thinks his diet solved. He didn't take Roddick's words lightly and was laser-focused from the first point of the match. He wiped the floor with the American in the first 2 sets, much to the annoyance of the American crowd. The next 2 sets were then a lot closer, with Andy picking up the third, but Djokovic ended up victorious in a 4th set tiebreak. The post-match interview was one of the fiercest in Djokovic's career, with boos ringing out from the crowd. Djokovic wasn't backing down though, saying,
"Well, obviously, Andy was saying that I have 16 injuries on the last match, so obviously I don't, right?"
The crowd continued to boo, but the young Djokovic didn't care. He was through to the semis, which he ended up losing to Roger Federer, the eventual winner. In fairness to Roddick, he wasn't being overly serious, and he definitely has a sense of humor. Years later, here's what he had to say reflecting on the match. "I was talking trash, and he came out and beat the pants off me, as he would, but then kind of chirped afterward," Andy Roddick said. "So he comes straight into the locker room, I went right up to him, had him right up against the locker. But then I realized his trainer was a little bit bigger than Donovan, and I kind of checked myself." What this video should teach you is that it's never a good idea to piss off Novak Djokovic. Most players already know that, as described in our video, Why Tennis Players Fear Novak, which you can check out below, but today's players definitely flew a little too close to the sun.